Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ryan Retro channel. In today's video we're going to be including the Odin 3 in our Windows game Shootout that I recorded a little while back, using my Snapdragon 8 Elite phone in place of the Odin 3 as I didn't have one yet. So today we're going to see how a real dedicated Snapdragon 8 Elite handheld fares against the competition, including the Steam Deck and a range of Snapdragon devices. We have the Retroid Pocket 5, the Retroid Pocket G2, the Odin 2 Portal, the Konkr Pocket Fit, my Samsung Fold 7 phone, and my Steam Deck. So let's see where this Odin 3 fits into the mix. It does have a possible advantage in that this is the 16GB variant, more RAM than anything else in the Shootout. The Retroid Pocket 5, Retroid Pocket G2, and Odin 2 Portal all have 8GB of RAM. The Samsung Fold 7 and Konkr Pocket Fit have 12GB of RAM, and this Odin 3 has 16GB of RAM, which should give it a little bit of an advantage maybe here and there, but let's see. I've redesigned the benchmark section of my website to better fit in with the aesthetic of the rest of my website. I've added the Steam Deck results from the previous test, and when this video goes live, you'll be able to see all of the Odin 3 results as well. All of the devices are toggleable on and off, so you can only see what you care about. You can choose whether you want to look at all games, only Switch, or only Windows. You can highlight the winner for each game, toggle mini mode if you're on a smaller screen, and turn on the rainbow color mode, which will rank everything from worst to best, red to green. So let's now see how the Odin 3 fits into that lineup and what kind of results we can get through these 12 games we're going to test, covering everything from little easy games like Monster Boy and Cuphead up to really challenging games like Elden Ring and Cyberpunk. So today, in order to follow along with the table nice and easily, we're going to go in alphabetical order. So we will begin with Cuphead. Just like in the previous video, I've set every game to extreme performance mode and toggled on TSO-enabled TSO memory, which I find gives the best performance. I've set the GPU driver to the latest available one, which for the Snapdragon 8 Elite here is 842.16 at the time of filming. And I've set all of the other things like DVXK version, VKD 3D version, all to the latest available options. Also, one more note, at the time of filming, the latest version of GameHub is version 5.3.5, but all of the other tests were made with 5.3.3, so I am using 5.3.3 here to keep everything consistent. I will set the performance to high performance mode and the fan on sport, so it's going to get pretty loud in here. We do also need to disable the frame limit so we can go above 60 frames per second. We will turn on native rendering plus, which should help with things like input latency, and also go through the settings of each game to make sure there are no frame limits in place there. Nothing like VSync, which could lock the frame rate at 30 or 60 frames per second. We want to have a nice unlocked frame rate for the sake of this test. So here we are in Cuphead. I have to say the screen on this thing is absolutely beautiful. The 120Hz refresh rate really makes a difference compared to a 60Hz handheld, and the nice large full-size analog sticks are certainly welcome as well. The frame rate seems to be over 300 frames per second here, somewhere in the 330s. It's quite crazy. Even when lots of things are happening on the screen, the lowest I've seen it go down to is 305. Let's get loads of things on the screen. 303 was the lowest I saw. The number I kept seeing consistently was 318. So let's put that into the chart. And that is a super healthy score there. For some reason or other in this game, I just couldn't get the Steam Deck to not be locked at 60. So we don't have a good comparison there, but it wipes the floor with everything else. A very encouraging start there for the Odin 3. Let's now move on to Cyberpunk 2077, the game that got one of the lowest FPS ratings in our previous test, as is to be expected. Here we are driving around in Cyberpunk 2077, and a very similar frame rate here to the Odin 2 Portal and the Konkr Pocket Fit. The Konkr Pocket Fit got around 16 frames per second, the Odin 2 Portal had around 15, here we're getting around 18 frames per second. Quite a lot of texture glitches though, the map has disappeared, all of the HUD elements have disappeared actually. Overall the frame rate is quite sporadic, and I'd say overall the frame rate that I've seen the most often is around 14 frames per second. So honestly, a little bit disappointing compared to my high expectations here. I thought we might get closer to 20. So maybe we'll need to do a bit more tinkering with drivers and other things like that on here. Because this does look beautiful on this screen, and it feels really nice to control. So if we can find a way to get some more frames out of this game, this could be a super nice experience. Next up is the game that was the most demanding in our previous shootout and got the worst results. Elden Ring. I'm really excited to see how this does. Here we go, let's see what kind of frame rate we can get as we look around. Again, there's a lot of texture glitching happening, which is not very encouraging. Oh, it's quite bad. But the frame rate is actually, I'm seeing 30 frames per second. It feels smooth. Oh. Whoops. The frame rate's at least around 25 frames per second, but quite often 60. This is very impressive. I mean, it might be a higher frame rate because it hasn't loaded any textures in, but this feels smooth. And if you look at the frame per second chart here, showing how smooth it is over time, it's just a straight line. This is incredibly impressive. I mean, of course, there's some real texture issues here we need to work out, but the performance here is very impressive. This is very smooth. If we can fix these texture glitches, maybe with some different drivers or different settings or a future update, this is more impressive than I imagined. This game struggled along at around 11 to 15 frames, excuse me, I'm trying to look at my chart. This game struggled at like 11 to 15 frames per second on other devices. Here we almost have a pretty perfect 30. That is very impressive. If anyone knows in the comments how to fix these texture glitches, please let me know, and I'll be making more Game Hub videos in the future. But for now, let's move on to the next game, GTA 5. Here we are in Grand Theft Auto, and the frame rate is fluctuating a bit. Once again, a few graphical issues. We were getting around 70 frames per second, now falling down to around the 50s. Once again, it feels really smooth because we are getting mostly around 60 or around the 50s. On this lovely display, it feels super smooth to me. The frame rate seems to mostly be around 65 frames per second. If I try to spin the camera around in many directions, try to get more going on the screen, let's just upgrade our car here. Oh my gosh, where did that guy come from? I'm so sorry, sir. Yeah, this is a lovely experience. Super playable, super smooth. If you'd like to play Grand Theft Auto, you're definitely going to be able to play it really nicely here on the Odin 3. This is lovely. I would say the overall frame rate, the one that I've seen the most often, is 67 frames per second. Very impressive. Next up we have Hades 2, a game that got some pretty high frame rates on my previous test. 124 frames per second on the Konkr Pocket Fit, 105 frames per second on my phone, which has the same chipset as this device, but without any cooling. Here we seem to have well over 200 frames per second, around 225. But let's see what happens with more on the screen, because this is a game that does fall down quite a lot when lots of things are on the screen. So when lots of things are on the screen, we're getting somewhere around 190 frames per second. Super nice, super smooth. Our next game is Hollow Knight Silksong, and I've started a new game just like I did on all of the other devices, and I'm kind of worried to even look at the frame per second chart on this game. I think it might be so many frames per second, it might break my eyes. We got well over 100 frames per second on all of our devices in the previous test. Only the Retroid Pocket 5 wasn't able to break the 100 frame per second barrier, which is fine because it only has a 60Hz screen anyway. And here we do seem to be well over 200 frames per second. The frame per second chart is going pretty crazy, but the frames per second do seem to be around 220. With a game like this, where the frame per second chart keeps going up and down quite a lot, and honestly with any game like this, when you really want to play the game, I would recommend coming in and turning on the frame limit and setting it to whatever is the maximum refresh rate of your screen. So I have a 120Hz screen here. When I set it to a 120Hz limit, we have a perfectly smooth frame graph here, and it will feel much smoother than going 200, 210, 220, 210, 200, 190. A perfectly smooth 120 will feel a lot nicer. But the point of today's test is to see how many frames we can get, and in this game we're getting around 220. Very impressive. Our next game up is Megabonk. Here our frame rate seems to be somewhere between 90 and about 120. I'm mostly seeing it in around the 90 range, and of course this is a game where eventually you get swarmed with an absolute ton of monsters that's bound to go down at some point, but I'm sure we'll be able to keep this pretty high with no problems. I'm going to say the average frame rate is around 90. After my last video testing this game, I got a great tip about how to massively improve your frame rate in this game, which I'll show you guys now in case you're interested. So look at my frame rate, it's around 90 frames per second. If you come into the settings and come down to input delay, change this from 1 to 0. You're then going to see the FPS jump up massively, and we've gone from 90 frames per second to now 200 frames per second. So really the frame rate of this device is 200 frames per second. But because I recorded my last test without using that little input delay trick, it wouldn't be fair for me to include that only on the Odin 3 and nothing else. So we're going to go with the original reading of 90 frames per second. But if you do want to play Megabonk on your device, I highly recommend coming into the settings and turning input delay down to 0. You'll get way better frame rates. Next up, we have Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom. This is the game I've played the most since getting my Odin 3. I've been playing this on GameHub Lite. Here is the regular version of GameHub to keep things consistent with my previous testing conditions. But on GameHub Lite, I've been putting quite a lot of time into this. I was setting the graphics to 1080p, high graphic settings, getting huge frame rates. It's just such a great looking game, and it sounds great through these speakers as well. Here we're getting over 200 frames per second. Around 220 frames per second is what I'm seeing the most often. So a pretty big improvement over all of the other Android devices and getting very close to the Steam Deck. Next up we have Need for Speed Rivals. This game, unfortunately for some reason, just seems to be locked at 30 frames per second. There doesn't seem to be any way of getting above 30 frames per second, at least not that I could find through any of the menus. It might be one of those games where you have to go into a separate launcher or something like that to unlock the frame rate. I couldn't find a way to unlock it, but just as pretty much all of the other devices got 30 frames per second in my previous video, except for the Retroid Pocket 5, which wouldn't open the game. Once again, no surprises here, we have a locked 30 frames per second. Look at that frame graph, is that not the straightest line you've ever seen? I do again notice some glitchy flickering textures, but not too bad. And overall, it just looks pretty good and runs nice and smooth. Next up we have Skyrim. Again, I seem to have locked this game to 60 frames per second this time in the launcher settings, but none of the other handhelds were actually able to get 60 frames per second, except for the Steam Deck. Here we are getting 60 frames per second when nothing is going on, but I do notice it dipping down when I get into the more open areas. It does seem to be around 57 to 60 frames per second, and occasionally when we are in the smaller areas, we do get a nice straight line for our frame graph. But I would say overall the frame rate here is around 57 frames per second. Bullseye. Our next game is Tomb Raider, and I really wanted to include this in the video because it has a built-in benchmark, which is nice and easy to use to compare frame rates between devices. But for some reason, it just doesn't launch. On the Odin 3 as well, it just will not open. The only device it would open on was my phone that has the same processor as this. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with this. I might remove it from the website, or I'll just keep trying to persevere with it. But right now, unfortunately, it's just not loading on anything except my phone and the Steam Deck. But the strange thing was it was working a couple of months ago. So maybe I have to just fiddle with the settings and see what could be stopping it from loading. A game that is loading and looking beautiful is Traveler's Rest, a game that I really like. It's kind of like Stardew Valley, but where you run your own bar. It's not quite as fleshed out and finished as Stardew Valley, but I do think it's quite cute and fun. Here we're getting over 70 frames per second, which is very impressive because I've been really struggling to run this game on so many devices in GameHub in the past. In the previous test, I think most of the devices got around 40 frames per second, so here we have a nice boost. The frame rate continues to fluctuate as is to be expected, but the frame rate seems to mostly be around 70 frames per second. I'm really impressed with this. This is lovely. So that was the last game in the list. Let's just see how the temperature is doing on the Odin 3 after all of this game testing, and then let's look at the full table and see how well it did. So I'll just bring in my thermal camera and let's see how hot it is. The hottest part over there on the left side of the screen is around 40.9 degrees. It's quite warm, but not too bad. Let's flip it over to the back and see if it's any hotter on the back. The hottest part is jumping around between the top vent and the side vent. It's around 41 degrees. Certainly not too bad, and it doesn't even feel very hot to the touch. I mentioned in my previous video that the Odin 3 gets really hot. It doesn't get really hot if you turn the fan on. I just think the fan's really loud. So I was turning the fan down to quiet mode, and the quiet mode doesn't really work that well. It gets quite warm, at least in my experience so far. I will continue to update you as I use it more and more, but so far my impressions are that when you have the fan on quiet mode, it gets a bit warm to the touch. And when you have it on sport mode, it cools it down really nicely, but it's very loud. So I hope they can fine tune that in the settings, we can get a nicer fan curve, and then I think, this is a fantastic device. Let me just bring in my decibel meter and turn the lights down a little bit, and I'll give you an idea of the difference in fan level noise between sport mode and quiet. Now, this is not the proper use of a decibel meter, just shoving it right in front of it, by the way, but you'll get an idea of a comparison. So right now my voice is like 80 decibels because I'm pretty loud. So I'll stop speaking and you can see how loud the fan is when it's on sport mode, and then I'll turn it down to quiet mode and you'll see this number go down. So that is the difference I'm talking about. It's a huge difference between quiet mode, which is basically silent, and sport mode, which is a racket. I do think they can push quiet mode a little bit more because quiet is truly silent, but it doesn't really seem to do almost anything. It seems to really warm up on quiet mode. So I really do think they could push quiet mode a bit and make it a little bit louder, but a bit more efficient at cooling. I think what we've seen today is there is huge potential here. This has the potential to be an incredible Steam Deck Lite. So if you have bought one of these to be your small, light, little Steam Deck Lite, I think you should feel validated and justified in your purchase. It is very good for this purpose. And if you haven't bought one yet, please check out my affiliate link in the description to the official AYN website, the same place I ordered my one, so you can get your own Steam Deck Lite and also help me out in the process. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you again tomorrow for our Switch shootout video on the AYN Odin 3. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.